Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and today we are talking about Matthew chapter 12. Specifically, we're talking about the beginning of Matthew chapter 12, where we've got ourselves a little controversy between the point of view characters, the good guy characters of the Gospel of Matthew. That would be Jesus and his pals, the disciples, and the bad guy characters of the Gospel of Matthew, which would be the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. These are the religious leaders. Now, this in itself is a flipping on the head of the narrative, because people in the original audience would have automatically thought that the religious leaders are the good guys because they're so well behaved, and not only do they obey all the rules, but they also get to make all the rules, and they get to tell you what the rules are, and only they really totally know what the rules are, because the rules aren't written down at this point in history. They're just passed down within this group of almost Jedi-like characters, but without the powers. And so you got this increasingly popular and highly unlikely hero character in Jesus, who's going around and doing stuff for people that the religious establishment can't do. He's actually fixing people's problems. And unlike the religious establishment, who advocate, like so many in political power positions do, for stuff that kind of mitigates suffering and a little bit makes things better. But eventually the institutionalism takes over, and these characters historically end up also kind of proliferating the problems, because the problems are what justify the existence of people in these institutional roles. So you've got the complete wild card in Jesus versus the complete institution card in the Pharisees. But theoretically, the Pharisees would be the good guys and awesome and brilliant, and Jesus would be the bad guy and the idiot and the outsider. Because, well, if the Pharisees don't like you, you're probably wrong, because the Pharisees own the law. They are the law. So Matthew 12:1 says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.'" And we haven't gotten any further yet. And we're going to get further next time around. But I want to continue to break down what the deal is here with the Pharisees and the law, and what law they were actually referencing. Jesus and the whole New Testament thing occurs in something that the Jewish people would refer to as the Second Temple period in their history. And this dates from, I don't know, whenever the Second Temple was completed, 5-something, I guess it would be, 30, I'm going to call it 530-something. I don't actually know exactly when it was, but I do know when the Second Temple period ended. It was in 70 AD, because that's when the Second Temple was destroyed. And this is a very different chunk of time than the First Temple period, part of which happened with a unified kingdom, part of which happened with a not unified kingdom, with the northern kingdom worshiping on a mountain up north in a completely different context, and there being a lot of controversy there. But the Second Temple period is one that was characterized by this oral law. You see, the commissioning that prompted the rebuilding of the temple in 530 whatever, I just cannot remember. You're all smart, and you can Google that if you want to know exactly when it was. The commissioning was from Cyrus the Great of Persia. Persia had just freshly conquered the seemingly unconquerable Babylonians, who were so awesome and tough that just a couple generations earlier, they had toppled the seemingly unconquerable Assyrians, who defeated the northern kingdom of Israel. So Persia, by proxy, it's like your AP rankings in college football. If Team A beats Team B and Team B beat Team D, dang, Team A, you are good. Persia was awesome, but Persia didn't like a policy that the Babylonians had. You see, the Babylonians had hoarded all the gods that they had hauled off from conquered people groups. And when the Persians came to town, the Babylonians were like, "Well, we'll just put all these gods out. And look, probably one of these gods is probably true." They were hedging their bets. And maybe if they all put their god powers together, they'll defend us from Persia. And it did not happen. So either by paranoia or by some stroke of wisdom, the Persians were like, "Nah, we're going to send all those gods home." And so they do. They send all the conquered gods back home. Now, I don't think they had the Ark of the Covenant, or there would have been some mention of that. But to send the God of the Israelites back home, they just sent the Israelites back home because they were in captivity. And part of the mandate there was, hey, you get to go rebuild your temple. And further, Cyrus the Great of Persia commissioned them to effectively, locally govern themselves as a protectorate almost of the Persian Empire. So what this means is that you need a whole bunch of religious scholarship to create a theocracy, kind of, but it's not a theocracy like earlier in the Old Testament when God actually showed up and did miracles all the time. And he's like, no, I'm right here. I am God. I am the king of your people. And these are the laws I made. And this is how I want you to do things. And I'll be judge and everything. Like, he actually kind of governed according to the text. Here, we're not getting any of that. In fact, when they dedicate the second temple, everybody's waiting for all of this amazing, miraculous, God shows up stuff to happen, like what happened at the dedication of the first temple. But nope, it just doesn't really go down that way. And so from the beginning, there's this tone of sadness. There's this pall over the second temple, which isn't nearly as impressive as the first one that Solomon built, that was even baked into that covenant that God made with David that we've talked about so many times, the one about the eternal kingdom. It wasn't the same. With the first temple, you got all these stories about people going into the Holy of Holies, like the place where God lives, and they just die if they touch the wrong thing. But in the second temple period, in the 50s, I guess it would be, 50s or 60s BC. I'm not doing very well on my specific dates today. When Pompey shows up, the Roman general shows up and sort of conquers Jerusalem, he's like, I want to know what's in the Holy of Holies. And according to the stories, he just goes in there and he does not die. He died years later coming ashore in Egypt. So, I mean, what gives? The second temple was just never as big a deal. It never had the same awe or the same feel of intimacy with God as the first temple. But the law is what really characterized the second temple. In the absence of God being here in the way we kind of remember from the first temple, we're going to have God be here in the presence of the law. Now, look, I'm not trying to pick on these people. I'm sympathetic to this. Can you imagine having cultural memory of God living among you? Well, that is the cultural memory that persisted for the people of Israel after they come back and scrape the vines and weeds and overgrowth off of Jerusalem and start rebuilding walls and build this much more modest temple that's reflective of their much more modest place in the world. And God doesn't really miraculously show up in the way that he did the last time around at the temple. How can you feel anything but empathy and hurt for that? And that's kind of a letdown. So if you're them, what are you going to do? You're going to sit around and pout about it? It was awesome before and it's not awesome now? No. You're going to get your butt in gear and you're going to govern as well as you can, and you're going to make sure that your rules are amazing and that you do not screw this thing up the way you screwed it up last time. The last time around, you got kings marrying crazy ladies from other countries, making deals with Egypt and sacrificing babies and just crazy stuff, worshiping all the other gods, really dark, ugly stuff. And finally, the deal with Moses said, like, if you honor me and obey me, then I'm going to bless you. And if you don't, I'm going to punish you. And finally, it looks like God just called in the deal and was like, all right, I'm going to use Assyria then to punish the northern 10 tribes of Israel. And in the 8th century, they get hauled off into captivity and they just vanish from history. Yikes. And then the same stuff goes on in the south, maybe not quite to the same degree, but eventually the same shenanigans or similar-ish shenanigans go on. And what do you know? The covenant with Moses still stands. You disobey God, he's going to punish you and correct you. Either way, everybody's going to know that he's God and you were his people. And Nebuchadnezzar comes and he conquers the southern kingdom. And now everything is ruined and gone, and all the promises of God, how could they ever come true? So now we have these lingering little promises out there, like you and I have looked at from the prophet Isaiah, stuff about this little shoot that is coming out of the burnt out stump of the family tree of Jesse. And that little shoot is so fragile and vulnerable, and it needs to be nurtured, and we cannot make the same mistakes and do the same stuff. We have got to be more strict than we have ever been. We need to write laws on top of laws, on top of laws, on top of laws, to make sure that that tiny little shoot grows up into a larger shoot and develops branches. And we have to nurture that along so that someday, if we do everything right, it can grow up into something that God could use to fulfill the promises he made to our last great king, King David. The promise that from the line of David, there is going to be this great kingdom and this great king, this Messiah, who's going to come and make stuff right. Now, the idea of the Messiah evolves over time, and of course, it gets to a point where it's very different in terms of what people are picturing from the Old Testament description or from what Jesus is holding himself out as, but that's a later question. Again, I am enormously empathetic to these people who came back and had one more chance to rebuild their people, rebuild their temple, rebuild their culture, all with the end in view of redemption and the presence of God, recapturing some former intimacy with God. connection with God and the presence of God. And they viewed this, again, like we talked about yesterday, not as a matter of individual behavior, stop it with the naughties. There's a little bit of that, but mostly this is a matter of national rightness and obeying God. Well, the charges that come in against this probably very well-intentioned mentality from the prophets, the minor prophets in particular, is you guys aren't getting it. Like, even as you're still in exile and you're trying to build out these rules and think about what went wrong, you're still not getting it. The problem always seems to be that people want to make it about their own effort and impressing God instead of loving God, giving God your heart. So why does Jesus show up and open with all of this stuff in the Sermon on the Mount about the heart? God wants your heart. He's not interested in your cold outward obedience to these rules. He wants you vested and bought into the values of the king and the values of the kingdom. Well, he opens with that because this hold on too tightly mentality that created this oral legal tradition that we still haven't really talked about yet, and we'll have to talk about more next time around. It ballooned into something that was soul crushing. It ballooned into something that actually ended up putting distance between God and people. But it was, again, so well-intentioned. As we get into the stuff that we're talking about the last couple days and over the next few days coming up, it's really easy to get the home team mentality going and to think of the quote-unquote bad guys in the Bible as just being idiots, just spiritual dolts who could not sort anything out and were wrong about everything, and all their motives were terrible. And look, they do some pretty ugly stuff, but I want to try to at least humanize them and help us understand how it got to where it is, because any good story where the bad guy makes sense, the good guy makes more sense. If you have a bad guy like Thanos, who makes this case, though not particularly compelling, but it seems like it maybe at first blush, like he's trying to make the world better. He's trying to solve problems, and he's willing to do ruthless things to do it. And you're like, no, I don't agree with you, but you're a compelling bad guy. And it makes the good guy's response all that much more interesting and understandable. That is why we're taking the time right now, as we're really getting to the fork in the road between Jesus and the people who are on the other side of the argument, to try to spell this thing out in terms of how we got here. Next time around, we're going to talk about that oral code of laws in more specificity, what it looked like, how it evolved, and where it was at in regards to, well, the example we're looking at right now in Matthew chapter 12, the Sabbath, by the time we get to the 1st century AD. And we actually have sources on that, and we're actually going to go carefully through it. Thanks for your patience with me and your interest in this stuff. Sometimes we got to chase down a few rabbit trails to really put ourselves in the shoes of the original audience to receive the text as they would have and to be able to understand it on its own merits. More on the evolution of the oral law and the people who passed it down, specifically the oral law as it pertains to the Sabbath, next time around. I'm Matt. This is a 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.